Thank you very much. I hope we'll have time for questions at the end. I don't know. Okay. Michal Ben-Horin is an associate professor of comparative literature at Bar-Ilan University. Her research focuses on memory, multilingualism, and musical poetics in German and Hebrew literature. She is the author of 2 monographs and is currently leading an Israeli Science Foundation-funded project on the bilingual poetry of Tuvia Rubna. I'm delighted to invite Professor Michal Ben-Horin to share her thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm grateful for Hanoch and Miriam for inviting me to share my thoughts with you. I'm a little bit of an outsider, as you will soon see, but I'm coming from the literary studies, but hope I would be able to contribute some thoughts. How do I use the PowerPoint here? Do you know? I think it's here, but I don't see it now. Magic. Just a few slides. So you have a magic?
No, it's not magic at all. Of course not.
Yeah. Okay. Can. So I'll just read out, and in order to be on time. Earth with Word, Nature, Humanity, and Ethics in Buber and Celan. This is the title I chose for this talk. And it is part of a wider project on which I wrote elsewhere, but just to concentrate on 2 cases. Mountains occupy a privileged place in German literary and philosophical traditions. They are often imagined as sites of revelation, self-discovery, and encounters with nature. It is therefore striking that both Martin Buber and Paul Celan place a mountain conversation at the center of the reflections on language and human existence. This lecture examines the figures of German Jewish mountaineers in mountain landscapes in their works as a way of exploring literary representations of nature. I argue that in contrast to the Romantic tradition, which often seeks to reconcile contradictions between humanity and nature within a higher unity, we talked elsewhere or before about identity, as exemplified by writers such as Ludwig Tieck, Adalbert Stifter, and E.T.A. Hoffmann, Buber and Celan instead seek to preserve difference while exploring the limits and possibilities of dialogue. Challenging forms of communication reduced to semantic meaning and passive reception, they imagine alternative ways of engaging with the world that exceeds the human nature divide, as I hope to show by granting mountain landscapes a voice and foregrounding the material dimensions of poetic language. These writers develop forms of relation grounded in participation, responsiveness, and responsibility while exploring alternative modes of belonging in the 20th century. To explore these questions, I focus on 2 mountain conversations. I begin with Martin Buber's early conception of Gespräch, as it emerges in Daniel, before turning to Paul Celan's Gespräch im Gebirg, conversation in the mountains, where the possibility of dialogue is tested under the conditions of historical catastrophe. While Buber explores how speech reaches beyond the self toward the other, Celan asked whether such an encounter remains possible after the collapse of both human community and linguistic certainty. Let me begin with Martin Buber and with the question of speech. By the late spring of 1912, Martin Buber had completed a draft of Daniel, which scholars have described as the first mature and comprehensive expression of Buber's philosophy, and at the same time the most creative and organically whole of his books to appear up till that time. Upon reading the draft, Gustav Landauer praised Buber's attempt to create a new philosophical language. Reflecting on this praise, Paul Mendes-Flohr suggests that, like many of his generation, Buber was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's attempt to create a poetic language capable of capturing the rhythms and corporeality of thought itself. Mendes-Flohr further relates this aspiration to Buber's desire to capture the directness and immediacy of speech, what he would later call the spokeness of speech, die Gesprochenheit der Sprache. This concern first emerged through the concept of Gespräch, conversation, and in Buber's mature thought developed into the notion of dialogue, Zwiegespräch. Published in 1913, Daniel opens with a first-person narrator recounting an experience shortly after descending from a mountain. Standing at the edge of a meadow, as twilight falls, he describes a moment of heightened awareness. And I'll start from the middle. I pressed my stick against the trunk of an oak tree, then I felt my contact with being in a twofold way. Here, where I held a stick, and there where it touched the bark. Though I seemed to be only where I stood, I nonetheless found myself there as well, where I encountered the tree. At that moment, conversation appeared to me. Damals erschien mir das Gespräch. And this is the translation of Maurice Friedman from, I think, the 80s or even earlier. This scene introduces the central concept of Gespräch, which emerges through an experience of simultaneous presence and relation. The narrator's awareness extends beyond the boundaries of the self, not through a dissolution of individuality, but through an encounter with the other, here embodied in the oak tree. Moreover, the narrator conveys the significance of the revelation embodied in the experience of conversation. Nearly 50 years later, Buber returned to this passage in a handwritten note added to a copy of Daniel. Looking back from the perspective of his later philosophy of dialogue, he explains that genuine speech, echte Rede, resembles the stick. It is a form of directed address through which something of the speaker reaches the other. And in the English, you have it already all together. But in the German, you could find it in different versions and editions. Buber's attempt to elucidate the revelation, to explain what that means through performative images that give voice to the abstract phenomenon of speech, where ganglion organs of speech help me to form and send forth the word, reveals a central tension in his project. As Paul Mendes-Flohr observes, palpitating with the typically lyric cadence of his prose and flashed with suggestive but hardly defined terms, Buber was eager to capture the directness of the spoken word while enmeshing it in the vocative power of poetic discourse. The glass dust does not simply explain the experience of Gespräch, it reenacts it through a language poised between speech and poetry. The relational space opened by this mode of expressions allows for participation and mutuality without collapsing the distinction between self and other. Resisting both subjective reduction and total submergence, it points toward a form of unity that preserves difference rather than overcoming it. How such unity is attained becomes the central question of the first dialogue, entitled On Direction, Conversation in the Mountain, Conversation or Dialogue, and in German von der Richtung Gespräch in den Bergen, which will be important for the Celan's text. In this dialogue, Daniel explains to his interlocutor that such unity is attained through Richtung, direction. Buber understands direction as the capacity to orient oneself toward a particular possibility and to realize it in action. His insistence on Richtung reflects his awareness of the danger of losing oneself in ecstatic experience, a concern that also resonates with Tick's romantic imaginary. Yet this vision of dialogue would soon encounter a historical catastrophe that transformed not only the conditions of human coexistence, but also the possibility of language itself. It is against this background that Celan's Conversation in the Mountains can be read. Celan reworks Buber's conception of conversation as an intermediary space in which the I reaches beyond itself toward the other without surrendering its distinctness. Whereas Buber employs auditory imagery to illustrate direction and to envision a unity that preserves plurality, Celan fashions his own rhythms to stage an encounter grounded in multiplicity and difference. In this sense, by invoking Gespräch, already signaled in the title of his prose work, Celan explores the possibility of communication into the mountains, beyond the limits of human language, through the search for an encounter with the other. Published in 1959, Gespräch in Gebirg, the only prose work to appear during Celan's lifetime, explores the entanglement of land and language within the exclusionary discourses that underpin the murderous politics of National Socialism. The story follows a Jewish wanderer who leaves his home one evening and heads towards the mountains. Along the way, he encounters his cousin, and the conversation interrupts the traditional ascent into the mountains, a space where national identity is often forged, whether through sacred revelation or fin de siècle nature ideology. These interruptions are accompanied by ruptures in the German language itself. In this context, the walking stick, die Wanderstock, carried by German mountaineers, acquires a different resonance through this association with the figure of the wandering Jew. And I quote from the story, "Came with his stick, came over the stone. Do you hear me? You hear me. I am the one, I am the one that you hear, that you think you hear. I am the other one." End of quote. The stick no longer functions as an instrument of orientation or mastery over the landscape. Instead, it becomes entangled in a fractured discourse of repetitions, doubling an uncertain address. The decisive moment of the text occurs not in the ascent itself, but in language, in the way conversation unfolds, materializes, and reaches outward toward both interlocutors and its readers. Moreover, this linguistic destabilization works against the conception of nature that lies at the heart of the story. The text unfolds in three movements. In the first, an omniscient narrator describes the protagonist's encounter on their way to the mountains. In the second, the conversation develops as the mountain heights emerge as a site of negative revelation. In the final section, dialogue gives way to a sorrowful soliloquy that bears witness to catastrophe. As the story progresses, a history of persecution and catastrophe surfaces through references to the natural world from which Jews have been symbolically and materially excluded. Within this landscape, within the homeland, they appear only as survivors or as disruptive intruders who shatter the tranquility of the pastoral scene. Because the Jew and nature, that's two very different things. Quote, "From this perspective, the narrator depicts the two protagonists as the babblers, standing in the middle of the road while the surrounding landscape is lovingly catalogued. That's beautiful," and I quote from the story, "that's beautiful. On the left is Tarkap in bloom, and on the right there is some rampion, and dianthus superbus, the superb pink, end of quote. Yet the protagonists fail or refuse to participate in this aestheticized vision of nature. This hostile portrayal of the protagonist's blindness to nature, coupled with the loud and unintelligible speech that disrupts the pastoral scene, is reinforced by the repeated call to a listener who may or may not hear. It underscores the exclusion of Jews not only from nature but also from and through a subjugating, distancing language. The full implications of this exclusion become apparent in the second section, where the protagonist adopts the very tools of objectification that have been used against him. He employs mechanical and quasi-scientific modes of measurement, scales, colors, and optical values, to describe the mountain landscape. Yet this language ultimately reveals its own limitations. After describing the mountains in these terms, the speaker arrives at what he calls a language with no I and no you. Pure he, pure it, pure they, and nothing but that. As Stefan Moses observes this passage stages a tension between narrative language grounded in the third person and dialogical language grounded in the relation between I and you, ish und du. This tension recalls the dialogical tradition associated with Buber and points towards the possibility of a self that reaches beyond its own closure through the other. The performative appeal, do you see, interrupts the impersonal discourse that excludes both the speaker and the listener from the world it describes, opposed to, quote, the kind of speech that counts here, end of quote, which aligns with the silent harmony of the mountain landscape and its beautiful road. The disturbing voice grows louder, like noise breaking through the order of pure language and landscape. It destabilizes established categories through fragmented syntax and insistent repetition, demanding to be heard and acknowledged. This time, however, what had previously been separated is recollected. I with the tour cup, I with the rampion, I with the burn down, transcending both orientation on and objectification. Yet these diverse, even contradictory threads of being do not resolve into a one-dimensional totality, human and inhuman, organic and inorganic, living and dead, man and nature, as well as I and you, here and there, the day and the days, seeing and not seeing, speaking and remaining silent. Whereas Buber's early conception of Gespräch remains tied to a search for unity, Celan inscribes radical otherness into poetic language itself. Furthermore, Celan's protagonist persistently calls out to the other who emerges as a you rather than merely as a he, a gesture that resonates with Buber's later dialogical vocabulary without fully coinciding with it. In doing so, he resists the reduction of the other to an object, to an it or a he, expelled from both nature and language. And I quote, "On the stone is where I lay back then, and next to me they were lying there, the others, lie there and slept and did not sleep." End of quote. Against this objectification of the human, which culminates in catastrophe, the I must reach a you in order to become a subject rather than remain trapped in impersonality. Only through an encounter with a listening other can the I truly speak with my mouth and my tongue and not just with my stick. Here, Celan contrasts embodied speech with the mute instrumentality represented by the stick, by distinguishing between speaking, sprechen, die Sprache, and talking, reder, Rede, des Menschen, or die echte Rede. Celan extends Buber's depiction of Gespräch in the prologue to Daniel. while questioning its ethical promise of reaching beyond the self and beyond the human, he nevertheless foregrounds the bodily organs of speech, the mouth and the tongue that make language possible. In doing so, he binds abstract speech and corporeal presence, transforming Buber's image of the stick into an encounter grounded in the vulnerability of embodied address. To conclude, the mountaineers depicted by Buber and Celan challenge the vision articulated by Tieck and other German romantics, who seek to reconcile the antinomies embodied in the relationship between human and nature. We see this in Buber's conception of dialogue, which is revealed to the narrator only after his descent from the mountain. His conversation in the mountains is guided by the search for a form of unity that preserves plurality rather than overcoming it. We see this even more forcefully in Celan's speaker, who probes the limits of conversation in order to resist both verbal and physical forms of subjugation. By replacing deceptive silence with an uncompromising and disruptive voice, he points toward the possible interconnectedness between human and non-human, self and other, without erasing their differences. Imbued with strange rhythms and images of vocal corporeality, the organs of speech in Buber and the mouth and tongue in Celan, these mountain landscapes gesture toward a language in which alterity can emerge. Such a language is not achieved by collapsing the distinction between earth and world, or between nature and humanity. Rather, it emerges through forms of encounter grounded in responsibility, responsiveness, and resonance. In the sense, for both Buber and Celan, the ethical relation to the earth begins not with knowledge, but with address, not with mastery, but with response. Thank you.
Thank you very much.